This is an attempt to develop, deepen, and in some ways maybe even revise a very important theory, developmental model called the faith development theory. This goes back to James Fowler. James Fowler was a theologian, and coming out of the structural developmental tradition that had been developed up to the work of Piaget and Kohlberg, he was interested in the question of how faith develops. Now, despite being a Christian theologian, for him, faith doesn't just mean religiosity, let alone kind of Christian religiosity. He was referring to something broader, more general, really talking about meaning and purpose. Overall, I think a lot of this does confirm the sense of like what drives development is the need to accommodate, right? Your older system isn't working, you've got to update it. If there wasn't a problem, you wouldn't keep growing. And this leads into what Rob did mention at the outset of sort of like, in a sense, operationalizing some of these insights and being able to say, all right, if this is sort of a kind of faith development pathway, how do we then help people orient to this and kind of get on that pathway and kind of give them tools to be able to deepen and develop in that sense, which at this point, again, is not just like a luxury, it's a necessity because of our global meta-crisis situation.
This is a really exciting initiative. Brendan has done an awesome job with everything he's taken on within the Institute of Applied Meta Theory. We obviously were very excited about the Cultural Complexity Index when we first got talking about that. The idea that we would look at the lower left and look at the hierarchical complexification of culture via the texts. And then in the course of that project, Brendan came across a set of people and resources that allowed for access to the Fowlerian data sets on faith development coming out of Europe. And it was, one of the largest data sets in the world that anything hadn't been done with it and updated for like, 2 or 3 decades, which I'm sure he'll tell you all about. But what was very clear immediately was like, oh, this is almost like a cousin from the lower left at CCI. It was the cousin in the upper left, and the idea of the complexification of meaning and ultimate concern. And immediately it was like, oh, this is just too good to pass up. So let's put in motion a new initiative to do something very similar methodologically to what CCI was already doing. And then concretely, because we're always trying to get to some sort of concrete social impact vector of this work, what we talked about was how would we create a faith development pathway, meaning an actual, like, once you have that reconstruction, how would you kind of anchor it in a protocol that said, okay, this is what we need at every level of faith development. And then could you make that available to the world so that more further innovation of actual developmental ultimate concern and existential sort of pathways could be built off of that. That would be a really powerful meta-theoretical protocolization of what's happening in the upper left. So Brendan was totally on board with that, and we kicked it off, and here we are. It's been just raging progress since we did that, which it feels like only a matter of months. So Brendan, fantastic job. Super excited about this update, and I think everybody should really tune in because this is pretty cool stuff and very groundbreaking.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, we've been kind of going at a roaring pace, and that's been really rewarding. And hopefully folks will get a sense by the end of this of how also these things are kind of mapping up to each other and starting to integrate and cohere. So I guess if I don't know if you want to spotlight me, or I'm just going to start sharing my screen and I'll dive in. So just bear with me for 1 second with the technical stuff. And then if someone can give me some kind of some audible sign that they are indeed seeing the
yes.
Okay,
looks like
great.
it's up and rolling.
Great. All right, wonderful. So yeah, thanks for that setup, Rob. This is an attempt to develop, deepen, and in some ways maybe even revise a very important theory, developmental model called the faith development theory. And so we're going to dive right into what that looks like and what the data is that's coming out of our work into this. Now, I will progress through a couple of kind of just simple major structuring points for this pretty directly. What is faith development theory to get us started? Then I'll look at the study that we did, focusing on both the quantitative and the qualitative analysis that we're able to draw from it. And then I'll conclude with some integrations and implications from all of this. So first off, what is faith development theory? Well, this goes back to James Fowler. James Fowler was a theologian, and coming out of the structural developmental tradition that had been developed up to the work of Piaget and Kohlberg. He was interested in the question of how faith develops. Now, despite being a Christian theologian, for him, faith doesn't just mean religiosity, let alone kind of Christian religiosity. He was referring to something broader, more general, really talking about meaning and purpose. And he kind of spells this out in detail in his works. But for him, faith and this construct of faith is a very kind of broad notion of how people relate to what you could call ultimate concern, ultimate senses of purpose and value and meaning. Draws a lot on the work of thinkers like Paul Tillich and some other theologians to really frame a very expansive notion of faith. And this is really significant for the work that I'm doing because I'm really focused on meaning making, and the evolution and development of meaning structures, which, again, when you see it from that sort of broader angle, you can really appreciate how this is a kind of universal phenomenon that can be expressed religiously, but also is sort of broader, operating at the level of people's sort of widest notion of meaning, significance, and in a sense, kind of their justification system that they're holding as a way of making sense of reality and how the world coheres. Now, for probing this topic of faith, Fowler and colleagues developed what they called the faith development interview. Coming out of the Piagetian tradition, they used a sort of like semi-structured clinical interview to get at this, but focused specifically not just on morality and not just on perspective taking, but some of the big kind of worldview, world coherence questions that people use to frame their understanding of reality. So really getting at, do you feel your life has meaning at present? Do you think that human life has a purpose? Asking about people's religious images and their symbols, how they conceive of God, how they conceive of ultimate reality. And there's a little bit of obviously sort of translating these concepts depending on who you're talking to, what faith background, what if there is a kind of particular religious background that they're coming from, but really trying to probe how people are conceptualizing kind of the big scheme of reality from the largest vantage, you could say. And again, to do this, Fowler was drawing on the structural developmental tradition that up to this point had really been the Piagetian tradition. John Piaget identified 4 major stages of development for the individual. And basically using this model of these 4 major stages, identified these particular stages of faith and linked these to the specific kind of Piagetian stages. I won't go into these in detail, but we can say, generally speaking, that we're looking at something like a 6-stage, or you could say 5-stage structure, because the first isn't really a stage; it's sort of an undifferentiated period. But by the time you get into the first stage, which related to Piaget's pre-operational stage of cognition, you've got kind of a fantastical, sort of childlike perception of meaning and kind of story that's rather disconnected and fragmented, and very sort of artificialist, animistic, and linked together by justifications that are kind of pre-causal in nature. There's not really the connective tissue of justification that we would think of as sort of causally coherent. This begins to change at stage 2, the mythic literal stage, which Fowler linked to the concrete operational stage in Piaget's system. Things start to become more solid and coherent. There's a kind of solidity to ideas, but people are working with myths and stories in a very literal way, not really seeing them as symbolic or deepening into the more profound emotional, affective side of these things, and sort of working with a bunch of individual stories to kind of ad hoc make sense of reality. Stage 3, synthetic conventional faith. This is early formal operations. And here you get basically people working in the collective justification system, usually of like a major cumulative religious tradition. And there's a move into this period that's highly group-centric now instead of egocentric. It's working with the symbols and images of one's community, of one's tradition, and largely accepting the significances of all those things kind of on trust, on faith, on the basis of religious authorities. And then as this deepens into what what Fowler started to parse out as the dichotomizing form of formal operations, you get into stage four, the individuative reflective stage of faith, where people start really thinking for themselves. They start questioning, start being critical, and they start saying, hey, what are the reasons for believing in this? What's the evidence? What's the proof? And there's a kind of application of a deeper scrutiny onto their inherited images and symbols and kind of worldview system. And then at stage five, the so-called conjunctive faith, which Fowler talks about as a kind of synthetic form of formal operations. There's a way that people can bring together the reflective side, but also kind of re-engage with their religious imaginary in a kind of a form of second naivete, which is a term that Fowler drew from Paul Ricoeur. And there's an embrace here of paradox, of kind of inherent tensions, and also the recognition that other traditions, other lineages are getting at some aspect of deeper ultimate reality, and a recognition then that kind of all language is kind of partial and incomplete, and and suffers from the inability to kind of deeply express ultimate reality in that sense. And then finally, there's a kind of postulated hypothetical universalizing faith stage, which was very, very rare, mostly philosophical, and even in Fowler's data didn't really show up in the empirical data, but was sort of a kind of orientation point to sort of the great sages and saints of history. So you can see here Fowler's connecting this up with Piaget's stages, and by the time we get to the synthetic conventional, you get a kind of increasing differentiation of formal operations into different notions of what that is signifying at these stages. So all that said, this version or presentation might be familiar to many here because Fowler's work is integrated in the integral theory that Wilbur uses and is part of the kind of synthetic view that he offers in relationship to the altitudes. It seemed this way, you can get the sense again of being able to link up these faith stages with other maybe stage models that you're familiar with. Though it is interesting because in this presentation, yes, the first stage is linked to the pre-operational, but then the second stage is linked also with the pre-operational, and the synthetic conventional is the concrete operational. So it's a little interesting how this presentation links those up in that particular way, because that wasn't necessarily how Fowler framed it. And as we'll see, there are actually probably more significantly improved ways that we can appreciate how these things are lining up with each other. So basically, in sum, the 1981 book Stages of Faith that Fowler puts out is working with this model. By this point, he's done 349 faith development interviews, and that is sort of the basis for the model of faith development that he then publishes here. He's considering faith as a kind of unique, irreducible construct. So it relies on, here's this third point, it relies on Piagetian cognition, which is necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient for the associated faith stage. So you can be of a particular cognitive stage and yet not display evidence of a particular faith stage. And this was also true in Kohlberg's notion of moral stages. There was something about Piagetian cognition that seemed to be the necessary but not sufficient component. And then, as we also saw, there's an interesting way that there's this breaking up of the formal operational stage into multiple kind of increasingly complex versions of that based on what Piaget had offered, which was that four-stage model. And of course, if you're talking about stages of higher complexity, you've got to kind of keep breaking that up into more nuanced versions. And we see that in Fowler's model. And then finally, the notion here is that, well, you're developing a model and you're getting a sense, almost a typology of what these different faith stages are. And later, Fowler would, with colleagues, develop a scoring manual and sort of say, all right, when you're doing the interview and someone says this, then you can kind of relate that to this stage. And this is called a content matching scoring system, where you have the basic setup and the kind of content that's coming through in the interviews being related to what's in the manual, and that's how things get scored. And this is basically where faith development theory was in the 80s into the 90s and even into the early 2000s. But unfortunately, a number of things happened in the early 21st century that kind of destabilized the faith development tradition. I won't get into all the details, but a big part of it was because of critiques leveled at the Piagetian system specifically, and really actually structural developmental models in general. There was a period towards the end of the 20th century where people critiqued Piaget. They found a number of problems and issues with how he'd set up his model, and some of which I discussed a little bit in the CCI presentation. But by the time you get to around 1980, there's been a sort of decline of engagement with Piagetian stage structures and a neo-Piagetian movement that arises to basically account for this, to revise the models, to update essentially the entire structural developmental tradition. And this is where the construct of hierarchical complexity comes from. I've got Piaget's major stages there on the side to kind of compare. But basically, hierarchical complexity emerges in the 80s and 90s as a construct that is a much more refined version of Piaget's model, and it also accounts for a lot of the shortcomings in the way that Piaget had sort of theorized how this works. So you get the work of Kurt Fischer and dynamic skill theory, and as well as Michael Commons and the model of hierarchical complexity. And they're basically charting the same developmental terrain. But again, you can see how compared to Piaget's model, especially, you've got greater granularity and increased sort of theoretical rigor and precision. Now, this in turn comes to be superseded when Theo Dawson, over the past 20 years, develops the lectical scale and operationalizes hierarchical complexity scoring at scale using computerized and automated scoring systems. And again, happy to talk about how this all works. Got into a little bit of it and more actually last time when I presented on the CCI. But basically, this is sort of, as far as I'm concerned, really the gold standard of structural developmental hierarchical complexity assessment and in the kind of core metric. It's at a level of granularity, you can see that's much more precise even than models of hierarchical complexity had been. You've got 100 points for each of those levels. And so you get the ability to get incredibly precise readings, whereas before, you kind of had a couple of large coarse-grained stages that you could maybe refer to. So at this point where we're at now in the refinements and the revisions of structural developmental theory, we've got this incredible tool set that we could use to update our older developmental models in light of these, really refined scale structures. And that's basically the question would be, how do we relate faith development theory to the lectical scale? How do we see if these particular stages map to particular levels of hierarchical complexity? And are there correspondences even between particular stages as identified by Fowler back in the 70s and what we can now measure with incredible granularity and precision using lectical scale? So that is basically the setup for our study, which is what sought to probe this question and see what the results were. So what we did for this was we acquired some of the original sample of faith development interviews that Fowler had used himself in the formulation of the stages of faith. So of that 349 sample set of interviews, we were able to acquire 38 of them. We extracted the interviewee responses out of those interviews, and then we submitted those to Lectica for scoring on the lectical scale. And then we performed some quantitative and qualitative analysis on the results. So without further ado, what are the results? We'll start with the quantitative analysis here. So this is a lovely picture, lovely little graph. You can see a wonderful trajectory of the data, you could say, kind of making a gradual increase from left to right. And indeed, what we found was that there's a statistically strong and significant correlation between Fowler faith stage and lectical score measuring hierarchical complexity. The Kendall's tau was 0.491, which was also, in this case, for people more familiar with Pearson's R, is equivalent roughly to 0.769. So this is a very strong correlation and a significant one. Now, here is the box plot presentation of the data. And I want to give a huge shout out to Henry Kurtz for doing the incredible statistical analysis on this data that came in. He's been really indispensable for this work and just doing excellent work, and also helped a lot with writing the paper and formulating the ideas and pre-registering our hypotheses. These are some density distribution charts, which I've got kind of the main picture there, but then I kind of broke it down on the right-hand side, kind of put them all stacked on top of each other. You can see how there's this sort of shifting wave from left to right as faith stage increases, so does hierarchical complexity. And you can start to see sort of the distributions there, moving from kind of hovering in the early 1000s and then shifting over higher, closer towards 1150. So that's the quantitative analysis, and happy to get into more of that. But what does it all really mean? How do we make sense of this? What does this feel like, this sort of a thing? Here I want to offer a little bit of the qualitative analysis to really make this kind of sink in and feel this in our bones, as it were. So going back to this chart here, we'll start with our one stage 2 performance that we had in the data set. And I'll quote where I can. I can't always quote directly from the interviews because not all of the interviewees consented to be quoted. Again, this is a data set that goes back to 1979. So also keep that in mind, which the fact that we're seeing this kind of correlation going back to the earliest faith development interviews done is really significant. And I think it's a profound testament to the structural developmental tradition in general, and to the kind of longevity and the durability of this kind of approach. But that being said, I'll quote where I can, but otherwise I'll kind of summarize what the interviewees were saying. So we'll dive in and we'll look at this first performance, which is, again, our only stage 2 performance. And in this interview, which was with an elderly Greek Orthodox woman, there was a couple questions that were asked, of course, relating to questions of ultimate concern and questions of religious authority, this sort of a thing. And the viewpoint that gets expressed that you see in the interview is one of sort of an unquestioning belief in religious authorities and the church structure. There's a belief espoused in that God will punish future generations of people if their ancestors committed sins, notions of imminent justice. Prayer is understood as a kind of reciprocal transactional engagement with the divine. So you ask for things, but if you don't give God things, then God won't give you things. It's kind of a classic, what's called do et dus, notion of I give so that you can give notion in religious thought. And when asked to offer a kind of a picture of how she understood the divine, the woman gestured to her Greek Orthodox icons and basically articulated a rather kind of anthropomorphic God concept, which is, again, another feature that we see characteristically at this stage. So very fascinating to see that show up at that level and at that score to give us a sort of benchmark for that. Moving on from stage 2 to stage 3, we'll look at a couple of instances here. So now we're moving into the early thousands in the lectical scale, which relates directly to early formal operations where we would expect to see stage 3s show up, and indeed we do. FDI 8 is a Catholic, thinks God would prefer it if more people were Catholic. There's a group-centered orientation at this stage. People think in terms of sort of their particular religious community and sort of absolutize that. In this performance, it was interesting because we're not too far away from stage 2 as the score shows, and there's very similar kinds of ideas here about like how prayer works, a kind of more magical notion of prayer for requesting favors and kind of making wishes, using the different prayers of the Catholic Church to do that. Very anthropomorphic God image, etc. Next one scores at 1028, a little bit higher, but expresses a kind of lack of interest of learning more about questioning faith or questioning religious authorities, content to sort of take their word, and having a God concept that's very personal, but not purely anthropomorphic. She sees God as being sort of always around and listening, but imagined like, as a disciplinarian, someone that you want to feel a little bit of discipline from, with sort of the the impression there. Last one here for stage 3 that we'll focus on, score 1035. So again, creeping further up into formal operations. There's a sense that religion is a set of rules that people follow, but there's a sense that motivation here matters, which is something that we start to see at this level of cognitive complexity, as a deepening of interiority, a sense of sort of mutuality and affect, and a deepening into that. Again, a sense that thinking about religious and theological issues isn't really something of particular interest to this person, but tends to question or trust the church without question. So these are showing up at this level of lectical complexity. Jumping up to stage 4, right around 1050, we start to see a shift. And here's where the stage 4s begin to show up, which is at this point we'd be calling it consolidated formal operations. So again, right on point with what Fowler had hypothesized in his day, moving now from early formal operations to what he called dichotomizing formal operations. Now we're able to talk about that more specifically in terms of numbers on the lectical scale. Here I'm able to quote some from the direct transcript, and it's fascinating because again, you've got kind of textbook version of what this individuative reflective faith style is about, which is looking for proof, looking for reasons, looking for evidence. The person says, it would have to be a logical reason in terms of relating to faith. Somebody could explain it to me, telling me why such things are done or why such things are allowed to happen for such and such a reason. I could understand it, perhaps. They express interest in science, in logic. And it's interesting because their God concept is no longer even sort of an invisibly personal, if not anthropomorphic deity. There's starting to be a move into other kinds of language that's much more naturalistic and even mechanistic. So they say, I wouldn't call it God, I would call it nature. I would say that there is something that controls this, yes, but we don't know what. So I'm moving into, again, a reconceiving of ultimate reality now from a more naturalistic angle, again, as characteristic descriptions of stage 4s would have it. The next one, around 1053, has a similar kind of God concept. We're moving out of notions of kind of traditional religious imagery, and we're using words like power, tremendous power. They doubt a kind of literalistic take. They say it's not like little stories about the Lord making man out of clay and standing them up against a fence and saying, you're done, you're done, you're done. I mean, it might not be that way, but I really feel that with all our faults and with all the things that we do, that human beings are too wonderful to have been an accident. And then they talk about a cosmic mind or power. So we're getting this shift of God concept here at this level of complexity to, again, increasingly abstract notions and more naturalistic conceptions. There's also what I read as sort of a deistic framework that begins to enter in here. And what I mean by that is, there's a notion in which God creates rules, but then, even God, in a sense, can't break the rules, right? If you want to think of the image of the watchmaker for this deistic conception that began to become very popular in the early Enlightenment period, there are certain kind of natural laws that God creates, and then people have to sort of follow them. And so this person has this sense that, people can't just pray for whatever they want, because then that would lead to chaos. Instead, prayer is about asking for help and strength in times when we don't feel to have enough. And so again, a shifting of what prayer is about. You're not asking for favors or wishes from the deity. You're also not even necessarily engaged in a kind of direct interpersonal or mutual affective relationship with a personal God. There's something more about seeking divinity's help with being strong and tackling the difficulties of life. And then finally here, you got this, again, this emphasis on evidence, on proof. And this person saying that they're finding more and more proof every time you turn around, and that these books of the Bible kind of have something to them, using evidence of dating of the papyrus and this sort of thing. So again, none of this showing up at the synthetic conventional stage where people basically just trusted their religious authorities. At the individuative reflective stage, which we see showing up here right about lectical level 1050 and up, we see this shift into wanting evidence, proof, and thinking critically about the tradition. We'll give one more from late level 4, which scored at 1077 at a 4.5. And similarly, notions that people don't have to attend church, that they can make church as they will. There's a questioning that goes on of faith. a recognition that scientific evidence doesn't reveal a heaven as traditionally conceived and sort of grappling with that, but also recognizing that questioning doesn't diminish faith, and that there's a kind of engagement in which people can hold scientific thought and religious commitment together in some kind of way, which starts to then gesture towards that conjunctive faith, which we see showing up here, where paradox and contradiction and multi-perspectivalism start to enter, and the failures of language to express ultimate reality start to be very deeply cognized and appreciated. We'll zoom in on this one, which scored at 1110. And this is actually the sort of literally textbook exemplar that Fowler uses as his stage 5 example in Stages of Faith. Comes out of this data set. He calls her Miss T, and yeah, her God concept is particularly sort of expansive. She draws on language from the Quakers and says that there is that of God in every man, using that as sort of a notion in which divinity is now something in a sense universal and also found in all different people all over the place, and yet also deeply personal in that sense that it shows up in everyone's sort of individual expression. Again, the recognition that symbolically language fails to capture the complexity or the fullness of absolute reality. She says the Quakers call it the light within. I don't think it matters a bit what you call it. I think some people are so fed up with the word God that you can't talk to them about God. Call it reality. All these would be spelled with a capital. Let us say reality or cosmic flow or love, and nobody can tell another about it. It has to come from within the individual because, of course, everyone has the same inheritance, religious structures in the mind. That interested me very much. That Carl Jung says if the analyst explores deeply enough, he comes across the religious symbols that are in every human mind. And so, again, a lot of the notions of stage 5 conjunctive faith, the relationship to archetypal notions and the unconscious start to show up in this stage, and we see that all reflected here. And in this case, scored lectically at 1110. So when we kind of take this all in and we see this sort of broad increase of complexity across the faith stages, we get this sort of band, this sort of, range of complexification where, again, hopefully now, having just read some of those excerpts and examples, we can get a sense of like what this actually means, what this really feels like, right? Like that score from 996 is a stage 2 mythic literal faith. And that 1110 that I just was sharing from is a stage 5 faith. And it's really operating in this, relatively speaking, narrow band of development, right from from level 9 up until level 11. And then there, I think, also begins to raise, there are other things that come out of this mapping of this kind, right? So, for example, the outliers. What we mentioned earlier as being the content matching approach that was being used here obviously didn't have the benefit of lectical scoring or structural analysis. It was going on in terms of content and in terms of what people had identified as being the content of particular stages, and then what were people saying, could we match these up? And then if we did that, that's how we would kind of score things. And that was informed by structural analysis, but it was still ultimately using surface content in order to do that scoring. And I mean, again, remarkably, using even that strategy, you get this kind of correlation. So that's nothing to shake a stick at, but look at these outliers and consider what they might mean. So this one, which was actually the highest scoring interview in the data set, was very fascinating when I read the whole thing. I mean, it's an apophatic mystical articulation of the divine, drawing on Eastern mystical thought and the unmanifest, and bridging religions from Christianity to Hinduism to occult astrology. And so reading this, you're like, well, okay, this reads a lot like a stage 5. But when I looked at the actual score it was given, and in this case, we had scoring notes that were used, the scorer, Sholok, said stage 5 is not achieved yet. And why? Because no paradox is represented as they read it. Paradoxes are discussed here only to the extent that they are collapsed and resolved. Paradox being unsustained. The issue score seems clear, stage 4. And so you get the sense that there's a very clear sense of content matching going on here. If there wasn't a clear sense in which someone was talking about an unresolved paradox, then I guess it can't be stage 5 necessarily. But if you're just looking at content, you're not looking at structure, then you can basically underscore a performance, as I think this one was done. Because when you actually read it and you see what it scores at, it seems much better as a 5. Similarly, you've got sort of texts or interviews that can be overscored. So this one was scored as a 5, and yet we can see that it's actually more in line with what we'd expect a late 4 to be. And again, when you actually look at the interview, and this one I can also quote from, you get a sense that this reads a lot like a late 4 as well. There's an emphasis on doubt, on questioning, on desire for proof. There's for example, I would like to have a reason to believe in such a thing as a human soul for sure, but now I'm not sure. Someone has to. I have to find a way of, I guess we all do, but we all have to find a way of proving that there is a soul, if in fact it can be proved. And it must be a rational way and a valid way of proving it. So there's, again, throughout this interview, a lot of emphasis on the rational, on the evidentiary, on the desire for proof. The God concept is a lot like what we see at stage 4s, which is a rejection of sort of personalistic and anthropomorphic images. This person was uncomfortable calling God a man or a woman, doesn't see God in human form, but again, refers to language like force and more abstract terms like that. A lot of stuff that we see, language that we see at stage 4. And what's interesting here is that despite, they're saying all this critical, reflective, kind of scrutinizing that they're doing, but they are still believing in God. And so they recognize this as being a bit of a contradiction, as they say. And of course, again, paradox and contradiction, if someone's talking about those things and that content gets matched to, oh, well, that's a stage 5, then you might see why it could be scored as a stage 5, when in fact, when you look at the structure of it, it's actually probably better a late stage 4. And so what this offers us, this lectical scoring, as you can see, is a couple of incredible things, right? Like we're able to really distill the structure from the content, so we're not making mistakes or in misscoring based on simple surface content. We're also able to see the really fine gradations of the complexification of these meaning and religious structures, right? So that when you look at that 996 of stage 2 and the early stage 3s at 1013, they're actually very similar to each other, and yet you can also see how one should be a stage 2 and one should be a stage 3. But you start to see the gradations in between, which I think is really fascinating. Now, again, with the benefit of this kind of structural analysis or lectical scoring, we can essentially use that information and better score what these texts could be. And this is sort of the more, let's just say, provisional aspect of what I think this is leading towards, right? If we were to be scoring faith development interviews on the lectical scale each time and using this as one of the chief aspects for our scoring criteria, I think that we would start to see even clearer correlations between lectical scale and faith stage. So this would be sort of a rescore done with the things that I've just been naming in mind. All right. Let's finish this up and talk about integrations and implications. So one of the things, of course, is how does this relate to maps that we're more familiar with? And that, I think, is a really important question. So with this data set, I do think we can start to map out these different altitude kind of stage structures as we're largely familiar with and start to situate those relative to the lectical scale. I think we're in the position now that we've got enough data to kind of see where those tend to cluster and what they tend to look like. So, starting down here with sort of late red, kind of umber, as you could call it, I suppose. Or no, I guess umber would be after, but this would be sort of late red, late level 2 into level 3, kind of clustering, high 900s. You move up into level 3. You're talking early, what Fowler called early formal operations, but we would now say early 1000s, between 1000 and 1050. And then by the time you get to stage 4, you really see that critical, thoughtful, reflective elements show up for the first time at 1050, right around 1050, and then clustering between 1050 and 1100. And then this conjunctive stage we see really showing up in a real way right around 1100 and clustering between 1100 and 1150. And these seem to be significant ways in which we can now track the stage altitudes and what we're seeing from the empirical data. Now, what's also important about this is that when we integrate this with our early findings from the CCI project and look at the lectical scores that we're getting from these different historical texts and cultural texts, we can begin to, for the first time, compare these. This is from the end of my presentation when I was talking about the CCI, and if people are interested, they can check that out. We started to be able to recognize these bands in which these particular corpora were clustering: the magical animistic around 900 and let's say between 850 and 950, and the mythological corpora really clustering between 950 and 1050, and then started to speculate and hypothesize, hey, maybe early rational shows up around 1050. Well, remember, we were just looking at early rational showing up at 1050 with the first individuative reflective stages here, and starting to wonder where this could go. We can now, of course, because we're using the same metric here, compare these and map them onto each other. So we can start to see, oh yeah, well, there weren't any stage 1 performances in this sample. So we're starting at the stage 2 and on into the synthetic conventional. And when we look at that, we can see that indeed, between let's say 950 and 1050, you get sort of the move out of late red into early amber. And you see at 1050, the emergence of the rational individual reflective structure showing up. And you see then what you could call the postmodern or post-postmodern beginning to show up around 11, and so on and so forth. Now, I think this is, well, again, very early, very preliminary, very promising, because it begins to show the way in which we could sort of recalibrate some of the meta-theoretical models that we've been using. When we go back to this presentation, we can actually see, what if we did something more like this? Here, I'm just showing you what we have empirical data for. I'm not saying that other things that are kind of slightly grayed out here aren't real or that they don't exist, but just that if you're looking at what is the data that we have and how can we actually peg these to specific levels of hierarchical complexity, how do these things map across each other? And I think something like this is what we're moving to. We're beginning to see indeed how using hierarchical complexity, specifically the granularity of the lectical scale, can allow us to make these kinds of comparisons, but with a lot more sort of empirical rigor and validation. And so happy to linger here for a minute, but I feel very confident, with a diagram like this, as we're filling in these details and being able to make these kinds of correlations and correspondences now. They're really, this picture is really starting to come into view. And so again, it's early yet. We've got a lot more CCI data to collect. And we've got a lot more FDI samples to score for the lectical scoring, and to be able to do all sorts of really exciting work with those. So this will continue to evolve, but this is us learning in real time what some of these hierarchical complexity correspondences can be. And when you start to map this in terms of those altitudes, and you see the blurring and the kind of full spectrum gradations that you see showing up, you do get this kind of significant validation of those kinds of meaning-making structures. But now we have a lot better sense of where they fall in terms of hierarchical complexity, and why and how we can meaningfully make correspondences between individual ontogenetic meaning-making development and historiogenetic developments of meaning structures and collective justification systems over time. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. That's my presentation. Would love to get questions, thoughts, spend some time with some Q&A.
I've got a couple comments since no one's jumping in here. First of all, this is just really, really fascinating stuff. And it's so interesting to start to get actually concrete with all of this. So I'll sort of point out two things that I noticed and see what your thoughts are on this, because I'm sure you've thought about this much more than I. Number one, just the how, as you say, narrow the bands are essentially on the lectical scores is just fascinating to me, that there could be this, essentially an entire stage of meaning making difference between 25 point score on Lectica. So I'd love to hear you comment on that and what your thoughts are on that. And then secondarily, I'm curious, I assume that because you have all these interview transcripts, you actually have the interview questions as well. And I'm curious if you have any interest or have thought about potentially extending, new interviews to folks that we suspect might be even disclosing further stages of faith than
Yeah.
Fowler had anticipated. So
Yeah, good questions. Well, so I'd say a few things, taking those in order, I guess. I mean, the gradations of development, I think, are things that people have intuitively recognized out in the world. We interact with folks and we feel those differences. I think it's been a challenge of being able to measure them with any degree of precision, right? And so with the Piagetian model, you get the first kind of approach. You get these major stages, and then you get the sub stages, and it's like, okay, we can use these and we can start to make these distinctions here. But again, they're very coarse grained, and so then you get the model of hierarchical complexity and Kurt Fisher's models, which are essentially tracking that, but in their own ways. And you're like, okay, now we've got greater refinement, but still they're pretty broad. I mean, like, if you're a child in school, basically a couple of grades is the equivalent of some of these, hierarchical complexity stages. And so it's like you're talking years of development. By the time you get to human development, or I'm sorry, adult development, adult human development, you've got basically what had been sort of two options, right? And this is how Theo Dawson talks about it. There's sort of like we've got two adult stages or we're used to, right? And it's sort of like, that doesn't give us a lot to work with. So the whole refinement of this particular scale has been what's allowed us to really zoom in and to see what those are and to be able to measure them. And so I would say that, yeah, what people have identified has been those real aspects that we're now able to measure with more rigor. But we just had fewer stages to be able to map onto those. So you saw that even kind of with the Wilbur presentation of like, well, we've got magenta and then we've got red. I guess we'll call them both pre-operational. Like they're clearly different, but we didn't have enough stages to like really map to all the things. And so we started kind of jumbling around. Well, I guess we'll call this concrete, even though Fowler said it was early formal operations. And in Fowler's case, he's like, this is formal operations, but I'm going to just break it up into 4 different kinds, So there was a need to do that, but it was all very speculative and kind of intuitive and, based on varying degrees of sort of rigor. This kind of scale is what allows us to really be able to do that with precision for the first time. And so it moved from half stages to quarter stages to then 5 points on that and then to 1 point. And I think now we're really being able to see what that difference is. And, the lectical scale, for example, has shown, with these reliability tests that like, one phase difference, which is a quarter of a lectical level, has real significant implications for like upper level managers, right? So like there'll be a standard deviation away one lectical phase, and you can see that in terms of when you and this was done also years ago now, so we've gotten even more precise since then. So basically, yeah, we've just really narrowed our measure to be able to zoom into that sort of granularity, and that means we don't have to kind of squish our stages into the pre-existing rubric that we have. We're able to be very specific about it. But yes, I think that's why this is so promising, is because now we can kind of quantify those intuitions that we've had a lot better and more empirically. And so the fact that there is a real significant difference between, let's just say 25 points on the lectical scale, I think, yeah, this is the sort of point where these things can become really, really rigorous. The second thing I would say about your second question is, yes, I'd love to start doing that. I have plans to, which is basically to start doing faith development interviews with folks. I'm playing around with the idea of integrating that with something just about to get launched through Lectica called MindLog, which is basically this tool people can use to track their own development using the same measurement scale that we're using for this. And so I have in my mind the notion that there could be some kind of like integration coaching function where people kind of sign up to take a faith development interview that gets those questions in a sense get scored on the lectical scale. Then people can get some prompts and some questions to see what it would be next steps and this sort of thing, and maybe their own development. But it wouldn't be a kind of classic faith development interview. It would be working with that model and trying to situate folks relative to their ideas around these things and see where, what that proximal zone of development is, and doing that all with lectical scoring, et cetera. Very kind of early idea, but I think it could be really promising for a number of reasons. Partly because it would, I think, be helpful for people to explore that part of themselves, but also because, yeah, it'd be the source of a lot of new data potentially if those people were willing to have their faith development interviews go into, being anonymized and used as data samples. You could really start to see things developing further. Yeah. So anyway, to be continued on that, but that is definitely a direction that I'm really interested in, seeing what comes out of the data when we do that. Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's wow. First off, congrats. That's a very clear articulation of what you're doing. It's obviously the power to quantify what you're doing, the way you're doing it, with the precision that you're doing is awesome. So my first basic comment is that. My second comment is at some level, I mean, just actually this causes my system to go all sorts of different ways. And nothing really precise because it depends a little bit more on kind of what your next steps are, what you're doing in relation. So I'll just share a couple of general thoughts. Sure. So needless to say, I've been thinking a lot about justification for the last 30 years, right? And that was going to be my whole thing, other than then the tree of knowledge, and then it took me out. But the process by which propositional networks complexify, the constraints in relationship, how people build these belief value networks individually and collectively, and what are the dynamics associated with this. So I remember, although unfortunately we had a bit of a falling out, for about 12 years, my best friend in the doctoral program that I was in, was his whole construct was beliefs and values, Craig Shealy. And there are a couple of papers we did together, or he did in relationship. He had the beliefs, events, and values inventory. And his whole thing was, what are these beliefs and values, structures, and then how do we assess the various dimensions of them, and what do they mean? And so essentially he built a system that I called an MMPI for justification system. So the MMPI is a classic structure in psychopathology. And then it's like, well, what would you look at to look at the various elements of justification? He built that prior to us coming together, and there was always a little bit of tension about, well, you kind of want to update this based on justification systems theory, and then a little bit of arm wrestle there. But there were these different categories. Okay, so the way in which you have established the faith category, right, as the ultimate meaning making category. And if you talk about psychology, right, like we go, well, what is psychology? Oh, it's self-world meaning making. When you reflect on the self, the narrative, the world, and we can use a little leaven, be like, okay, what's your little cognitive light cone, right? What's the radius of the capacity of constraint that you need? Well, if you're a local social actor, right, in a conventional structure, then the things that you need to worry about and the things that you can abstract upon are, well, what's the authority that I need to defer to organize my life? And so then you're on the left side of this graph, right? It's like you're going to bind yourself, and then that becomes what's legitimized. And then anything outside of that immediately becomes ambiguous because you don't know how to place it in any kind of way to relate to. And then of course you get an expanding cognitive light cone, which then increases the abstraction. And then it's really this positive negative territory where you're asking these questions and you're having a hard time. And then what level of paradox, if you want to use it, like, okay, well, I don't know this, but I do know this, and this is how I'm going to invest, and this is how I'm going to relate to other people that might invest differently, and you're just going up the stack in relation. The way you map that is fucking brilliant. I mean, it's just really very quantitatively. I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing and of course, that's what people, I used to think that quantification is absolutely cringe, and I still do. I'm still a behavioral scientist. It's just like, oh my God, that side of me was so obsessed with it that it drive me crazy, and here I am. But wow, what a beautiful thing. So those are all just sort of that's not a very justified frame of reference. It's a little scatterbrained, but I want you to know I'm happy to dialogue more about the structure and complexification of justification, how our different parts are integrated, they're differentiated, what is the sort of the radius of them, why would they be constrained in a particular way, what is the individual social actor relation, how would they develop from one stage to another. There's a lot of specification that I would perhaps be able to bring to that. We haven't talked through, but you've already laid out a structure that would enable us to frame that set of questions, and be really awesome. So but really kudos. That's the first and basic point that I would make, man. That's awesome.
Thanks. No, and yes, let's have those conversations for sure. In my own work right now in the evolution of meaning, of course, draw really heavily on your framing, on the UTalk framing, and the justification systems theory is a big part of that. And one way of conceiving this upper left analysis and the CCI's lower left analysis is basically a social scientific quantitative research project into the question of justification systems theory and trying to map that with some specificity. We were able to talk a little bit about that when you were here at Sky Meadow the other week. And so I very much view it that way. And I also then see the possibility for integrations of these projects with the IAM initiative, engaging with the unified worldview and all that, as deeply consonant with all this. So there's a lot of plugging in that could happen, but I'd love to hear some of those specific constraints and those dynamics. I think you did a great job just now, like a beautiful job, talking about what some of those are, and kind of the locus of authority and the social horizon, which are actually two of the aspects that Fowler introduces for his faith construct. So locus of authority, who do I look to do I just trust the religious authorities, or do I say, hey, I don't, let me think about that, these kinds of things. This is this expanding locus of authority, or you could say a decentration of locus of authority as it moves particularly towards the individual and the taking on the responsibility for sort of being able to justify why one thinks what one thinks instead of deferring to external sources. And then as that relates to bounds of social horizon or bounds of social awareness, it's sort of like, who are my people? Is it me? Is it my family? Is it my community? Is it my are we part of some kind of more abstract imagined community? And as that those bounds of social concern extend, that's very much the Levin cognitive light cone, and it's also very much how people are justifying their senses of the ultimate environment, as Fowler talks about. So anyway, all this stuff directly plugs in, directly relates, and I'd love to sync that
yeah,
all
I'll just one plug, then I'll shut up. But so I don't know if you've ever heard of Dan McAdams, but he's pretty well known. Bridges personality and social, articulating the self. His simplistic, I mean, and he's got a rich thing, but he offers really nice three categories that then bridge. So the initial stage that you're socialized into, he calls social actor. So the social actor basically is internalizing the rules of what's legitimate. You're allowed to jump into one role or another. Kids will play act, but you basically defer to the role of the authority. That's what the social actor is doing. And then you evolve. By 6, you're able to do that, and that's why culturally by 6 people can play the role of little persons, and they give them little justifying capacity because they're actually, oh, this is what a right person would do, and this is how I know what right and wrong is based on deferral to authority in a social context. They're not making, unless they're super precocious, they're not making recursive loops until adolescence, where then you become an agent, where you're like, wait a minute, I get to choose what the authority is. So his second phase is agency, and then that taps out with sort of formal stuff for many people, but ultimately if you continue to go, then you are become an autobiographer in the context of a theme. So though you see then the world as a theme, and then you place yourself into a particular protagonist, which then doesn't bind you to agency descriptions of what you're doing in the here and now specifically, although you're still making those, but it binds the thematic narrative that you have as to whether or not you're going to live a generative life, and how you would do that across much longer, say, cognitive light cone horizon. So that's the story of yourself in relationship to the universe. So that's just another example of kind of where you could angle all this stuff. Brilliant. So anyway, I'll shut up. That's love it.
Love it.
Great.
Love it. We go to Chris next.
Yeah, you mentioned social horizon. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on how this all plays into everything going on in the world and the meta crisis, and what are the connections there? And you could probably spend an hour or so on
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, in a nutshell, right? It's sort of one way of thinking about social horizon is externalization, right? One of the kind of systemic issues that we face is that we're externalizing things when there isn't an externality anymore. We're in a global system, so there is no outside the system. If you're not able individually to cognize that you are, let's say that your environment is no longer just your immediate local actor environment, but it's actually a global environment. If you're not able to inhabit that, then the behavioral investments, I guess, to use more UTOC language here, are going to orient you to certain kinds of decision making that are going to still make externalizing decisions, but they're then going to be very deleterious to you and everyone else. So if we're going to tackle collectively the meta crisis, I think this is one of the chief arguments to be made, right? Is that like there's some inner development aspect that's deeply related to that. We can't just think about the lower right and trying to change systems. We also have to think about how we are conceiving of reality and what our ultimate environment is. If your ultimate environment is narrow and it's sort of, well, I'm kind of thinking about my house and my family and I'm driving up the road, so I'll just toss my trash out the window and now that's gone. I don't have to worry about that, right? And then as you expand that out, you're like, oh, wait a second, like that does impact me and it does impact other people. And you start to feel that. And then when you kind of scale that understanding, it's like, hey, when I buy this product and it's, made from this material that's causing this over here in this rainforest, that, it's a scaling aspect of what we're able to conceive of as directly related to me and what I value and what I care about and what's meaningful to me. So in some senses, to tackle the meta crisis, we have to tackle the meaning crisis, which is kind of the ceiling element, you could say, where a lot of our linear, analytical, scientific kind of rational thought is kind of the ceiling for a lot of folks, and maybe that'll rise to the level of a certain kind of systemic awareness where we're recognizing ideologies and these sorts of things. But for the most part, there's not enough kind of say planetary global cognition going on where we're recognizing our direct impact at a holistic level. So this kind of work starts to be able to say, what is that level of cognition needed to be able to kind of cognize at that scale? And actually, Lectica and CRI, Zach Stein and the Civilization Research Institute are doing some meta-crisis lectical analysis in terms of how people conceive of global civilizational existential risk relative to these different lectical levels. And so basically, yes, as you're right, I could say a lot more about that, but that's sort of the gist of it, right? Is that, and this leads into what Rob did mention at the outset of sort of like, in a sense, operationalizing some of these insights and being able to say, all right, if this is sort of a kind of faith development pathway, how do we then help people orient to this and kind of get on that pathway and kind of give them tools to be able to deepen and develop in that sense, which at this point, again, is not just like a luxury, it's a necessity because of our global meta-crisis situation. So I hope that makes sense. But yeah, there's a lot more that could be said about that. I think, yeah, thanks for the question. And I think, Rob, you were next, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, great. Brendan, awesome work, man. I really love this research, and I feel I've been hoping and waiting for someone to sort of do this kind of thing for a long time. So it's really exciting to see it actually happening and happening at such a high level. And obviously just so important, as we just discussed, for addressing the meaning crisis, which for me is at the heart of the meta crisis. And one of my thoughts around it is like, one of the concerns with these kinds of models is that we're starting with these very small samples of 360 some odd interviews, very much encapsulated in a geohistorical trajectory of the late 1970s and whatnot, and probably not a representative sample of really anything. This is a very idiosyncratic sample as far as I know. And one of the concerns that I see across these developmental models in general is that we get these initial results that are very much situated, and then we start creating a scoring system based on some of that content. And it seems like there's very little reflection about the dangers of a reification of some of this content, rather than, are we really getting at the deep structure of what the universal development of faith is across culture, across history? And the paradox example you gave, I think, is a good one, that they're zooming in on this notion of paradox. Do we find content that we can code as paradox? No, we don't. So it must be at this stage. I think there's a lot of problems there, and I think that introducing the lectical granularity and kind of cross-referencing that and triangulating that, I think, is the beginning of starting to sort some of those issues out. But I'm curious, if you can address that kind of problem, and then how how you or we might start to do more research that could kind of mitigate those problems,
Yeah.
avoid these kinds of problematic reifications of potentially idiosyncratic content pieces, and move towards mapping what is, arguably more of a universal structure, so that the whole thing has more potency and punch in terms of like, hey, this is a universal development. This really can help us address the meaning crisis, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, to begin with, and you've already hit on it, is like moving from content to structure is really important, and to have the tools to be able to effectively do that. I feel like we're finally there for the first time. And what I think is so fascinating is that when you do that, it's not like the content aspects are wrong. You're just seeing that they're a partial instantiation of these deeper structures. So it's like, ah, yes, those models were getting at something real, but that's not the entirety of it. And when you have the structure, then you can see how else that can manifest. And so these tools allow us to begin to make more of those leaps. Also, to your point, yeah, this was a small sample. We are going to be next tackling about a sample about 10 times as large as this. Rob mentioned at the outset, there's some scholars at the University of the South I've connected with, and they've got a vaster database of these fate development interviews that I now am ready to send off to Lectica for the same kind of process. And so we'll be able to do more kinds of work with more data. One of the critiques of Fowler's work early on was, hey, this skews white, it skews male, it skews Christian, ... And that was very much, there wasn't a huge gender disparity, but definitely it skewed, white Christian, somewhat upper class, this sort of thing. And because of that being a small sample, that's a problem for the theory. Since then, in the past 20 years, there's been a much bigger sample. More FDIs have been administered, and you've got international, you've got men, women, you've got socioeconomic status, you've got a whole bunch of a much more diverse sampled race and ethnicity. So it's encouraging to see what we'll find as we begin to analyze that data, and take this analysis going forward. Asterisk there, because this will get a little bit messier, because I won't get into all the details, but some of the theory starts to shift and some of the theory gets disconnected from this structural tradition. And so actually the scores of those interviews are going to become a lot messier than the ones that Fowler and co were doing, because they were really steeped in the structural developmental tradition. But what at the least it can give us is we'll have the interviews and we'll have the lectical scores, and then we can actually in some senses kind of empirically deduce the rest, if that makes sense, right? Instead of like, oh, we've basically set up now a stage typology and we'll look at the score and does this map. Well, regardless of how these might have been scored, we'll see what the content is and we'll know what the structural scoring is. And we could basically do a kind of reinvention of fate development theory based on enough of this data to get us there, which I'm excited about. But back to the heart of your question, I think that all that helps. I guess what I'm saying is having a more diverse sample and a larger sample helps. Getting more at the structure and not the content helps. But also continuing to collect different kinds of data, and also, continuing to relate these things into contexts and social environments where they haven't been deployed before, or that sort of thing. I mean, even Kohlberg and Piaget, their tests, their kinds of measurements and assessments were deployed in all sorts of cross-cultural contexts, but they always had to be modified to make sense in the cultural context, right? One of the great failures of kind of early cross-cultural Piagetian study was it's like you're presenting someone with a task that they don't they don't have the shared cultural milieu to even understand. But if you ask them the same, if you're trying to probe the same structural level using a task that they are more familiar with, then they're going to perform with a lot more competency. So this led to a lot of underscoring of other cultures based on kind of Western centric assessment systems. And this kind of tool, like the lectical scoring, is able to get beyond some of those limitations. It is still based in English primarily, so that's it can do translation, but to really broaden this out, there are things that could be done, and we're sort of at the beginning of this. But yeah, I think that is a really important part going forward of really trying to broaden these ideas further and making them more genuinely universal if we can. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for that answer. The last thing I would just add to it is I think, eventually if we can work towards working with representative samples of entire countries, I think that's the sort of, that would be the goal. So
Yeah, and on that last point, we're not there yet, but I'm really interested in where this could go from a big data perspective, right? I mean, this is we're not there yet, but imagine if one had the capacity to work with huge data sets and be able to get, really population level samples that you could then analyze and that sort of thing. I don't know what all that would take to get us there, but it's not inconceivable, and it's a really exciting prospect. So, yeah.
certainly. Thank you.
Yeah. Rob, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. The A in IAM is applied, so I'm always coming back to how do we get the stuff off the page and into the world in socially operational ways. The new story of wholeness is obviously one of our biggest efforts to do that inside of the worldview program. And it really gets at the heart of everything we're talking about here. So the question of faith and what is of ultimate concern to people, what is meaningful, what are the justification systems that are kind of holding them in place or that are disintegrating in the face of a torrential pace of change, and no longer are their epistemics, able to keep track of what their worldview is, and obviously that worldview. So all of the themes of what we have going on here in each initiative kind of find expression in what has to be and this is ultimately where I think has to start, in a good theory of change. Like what matters to me is that we take our various initiatives, from the meta crisis to the unified worldview initiative to the faith development, cultural complexity, Greg, your body of work, other bodies of work, and we have to come up with a coherent, good theory of change about what we're going to do with our precious breaths, right? That goes beyond publishing papers, and papers are important. So don't get me wrong. Like, there's a reason we have a research program too, and this is part of it. This project is part of the research program. But when we go to the worldview program, if our theory of change is, well, okay, we need to present people with the obvious choice that there actually is a new worldview under development, it is emerging, and it's going to take you from, to use Greg's reference to McAdams, like it's going to take you, like one of the worldviews is all about social actors, one of the worldviews, or maybe two of them are all about agents, and then there's a new one that really is about autobiography or something even, perhaps a little more mature than that, and that's a choice. And so we're not going to create an educative identity forming experience on the web that's meant as a call to action to this. I suppose my comment is it's a question in the form of an open discussion. Like, I think we have to take the implications of this body of work, and we have to ground it really practically, strategically, in then what does it mean for who we should be targeting? What is the stages of readiness in terms of who's open to influence to that messaging, right? In terms of maybe faith, in terms of justification, in terms of these various things. Who should we be targeting? Our view is it should be cognitive elites, but what does that mean? And then, is our theory of change right? Like, is our strategy psychologically grounded that, yeah, if you put that in front of them, that might be something that might be really powerful. That's what matters to me, is to now use this recursively to influence and justify our own strategy to ourselves, so we can not spend 2 years working on something and going, oh, we actually defied our own logic in some way. Like, we defied what we knew about their openness to influence, for example. So I'd love for us to lean into that. Maybe a few minutes here, but coming up, looking forward to more of that project symposium that we're going to be doing. I think this is really rich and important territory for us to dive into.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that this relates to all that. I mean, on one level, if we're trying to spread, share, disseminate, and get people excited about an integrative worldview, we want to have a really solid, well-grounded, well-substantiated worldview. So part of this work is basically getting really clear about what we can say about what that worldview is. If there's a layered ontology, if there's a developmental angle, what are the models? How do we measure these kinds of things? And I think that heretofore we've had some really good syntheses of a lot of this stuff coming together, but we're also starting to see, oh, well, this doesn't quite work there. And if we make this move, actually, this can have really negative downstream consequences, et cetera. So this is sort of a clarification and a purification in some senses of like getting really specific, clear, rarefied about what that worldview is in terms of what the pillars that it's standing on and how confident we can be in that. That's there. Then there's also if we are aiming at sort of cognitive elites, I think those folks are really going to value that, right? They're not going to value, oh well, there's this developmental thing, and don't you know there's a bunch of developmental models? It's like, okay, well, has anyone done the work of like actually rigorously comparing and testing and established correspondences at some so the folks that we're aiming at as being these these elite change makers, I think are specifically the demographic who will care about this kind of intellectual underlaboring. And if we don't do it, then we're kind of that doesn't look great, and it kind of seeds the ground to people who are coming out there saying, "Hey, my thing's based on thermodynamic entropy, and don't you know we're all just dissipating energy, and so we should all just be accelerationists, right?" So it's like we gotta up the theoretical ante for that purpose. The other thing is when we clarify the models, we have a better sense of what the actual demographics are that we're trying to speak to. If we're working with broken typology systems and thinking that's a developmental model, then we're going to start targeting people using particular language, thinking, well, don't you know that this stage cares all about paradox and contradiction? But actually, that's just surface level, right? That's not actually getting to the deeper structure. So if we're not able to make these clarifications at the theoretical level, they're going to hinder our own sort of communication efforts and our strategy. So all those things are I think deeply intertwined with each other. And I do see a lot of what I'm doing as sort of the R&D element to this enterprise, right? It's like we're not necessarily generating iPhones over here, but we're maybe getting at the kind of like discovering semiconductors and the kind of quantum mechanics that can then produce the next technology. So I have incredible appreciation and just like humble awe, before the work that like Chris is doing, where that application level is like really on the ground and really, but for this, I feel like these things need to work in tandem. They got to dance together, where we're like always updating and refining our theory, and then that it kind of can be fed back into the application side. So, but I do recognize, I mean, that's always going to be a bit of a tension there at the application level, especially when that's the focus. And then the last thing I'll say, which I'll kind of always keep harping back to, is like a big element for me in the theory of change is paradigm shift and education institutional shift, right? So our current system is collapsing in large part because we basically hollowed out the bottom, which is to say the intergenerational transmission in an effective way, because our education system's broken. So if we don't have a good sense of development and we don't have a good sense of actually using solid developmental models and thinking about how people are thinking and how people grow, then we're not going to get anywhere. And that's why these models are really, really helpful. And two, on the paradigm shifting front, we can yell till we're blue in the face about, hey, it's all about the development, and don't you know there's this whole psychocultural complexification narrative, professors and academia. But if they're like, yeah, that's what people were saying a long time ago, but no one ever did any, well, that's all just kind of hearsay and just so stories. If we don't have like, actually, here's a bunch of data and quantifiable and based on hundreds of years of, robust intellectual traditions that, are now being developed into operationalized cutting edge technology, we can't do that. And then it's hard to have those conversations. It's hard to shift the paradigm in our elite academic educational systems. So yeah, it's like at a certain level, it is publishing papers, but if we can do even the publishing papers part really strategically, then we are able to find certain leverage points at multiple points in our systems that I think can have a big impact. That's my hope. So that's
Yeah.
also a part of that.
Yeah,
too,
and just to
change.
be clear, no, obviously I'm a huge fan of us doing all the research that we're doing, and I do know how important that underlaboring is for sure. I also want it to inform our very strategic sort of,
Yeah.
outlooks because, what does faith tell us about worldviews? Like, are we barking up the right tree when we talk about these four worldviews? Well, maybe this faith research says, well, not quite. Like maybe it should be more differentiated than that, or maybe it should be confounded in some way. So that's the kind of thing that I think would be great to get into.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Alan. Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's a follow on from Rob's, which is where the studies getting and great work in terms of getting more granularity. I'm interested in the between, like what is psychoactive between, at what stage in the data do people kind of look up, move up, and what's the active between? So, where are you going, how do you get there? I'm always interested in the gap, how do we get there? So I'm just wondering if there's anything in the data that it's a snapshot in time. Obviously, if you took that again, down the track, you might see something different, and then you might notice what shifts that. Just wondering if there's anything out of those data sets that kind of points to that psychoactive, and what you got a good the strata's getting clearer and clearer. The moving between is the thing next.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't see any very clear trends in this relatively small data sample to be like, this is what did it for this person or something like that. But I mean, overall, I think a lot of this does confirm the sense of like, what drives development is the need to accommodate, right? Your older system isn't working, you've got to update it. If there wasn't a problem, you wouldn't keep growing. And so I think there is this sense in which problems are continually driving our need to be more adaptive at problem solving. And I think so, therefore, there will always be that element of what drives a lot of people's complexification is just continually having this feedback cycle of like, there's this other thing I didn't account for, and like, I tried this, but that didn't quite work. So and so that I feel like is this motor for a lot of folks, and there isn't really a way of necessarily like, well, I'll put it this way: there are better or worse pedagogical contexts that can work with those dynamics, right? But there's also like, creating problems for people isn't necessarily the best pedagogical approach. Problems arise organically in the midst of the stream of life, and so different people are going to, rise to the challenge of those or not, or find various coping strategies, etc. So I don't think there's a silver bullet to all of that. I think we have a sense of how and why people do develop and continue to complexify. I do think also there is an element in which, we should appreciate that it's not always just about getting people to that next stage or that next level or whatever. I think if we kind of reshift the focus a little bit and allow people to grow organically, that's actually a much better strategy than trying to push people to the next stage, to the next stage, to the next stage. And we see what it looks like when certain developmental cycles get broken or interrupted, and people are trying to deposit new information at a level that people aren't ready for. And it doesn't really sync up, and it doesn't really mean anything, and it's really artificial and kind of forced. And that's not the kind of growth that really helps anyone. So I think these shifts of thinking about development differently, focusing on much more the individual and their developmental curve rather than doing a lot of comparing to other folks, trying to balance that at the same time when we do need collectively to, kind of raise the level, as it were. Otherwise, we're really collectively in trouble, is like a huge systemic challenge. I don't have a good answer for that. I will say also, and this also relates back to the application part, which is I do see very soon down the pike the potential for really working with these systems, like these scoring systems, in a very close way that can really help people's development in any number of skill sets. So that if you're like a coach or you're doing consultancy and you're working with MindLog and you're working with a client, and you're getting a sense of where they're at, and you've done multiple assessments and you're getting a sense of their curve, you're able to much better hone what would be helpful for that person based on where they've been and that sort of thing with that kind of data. And so I see that taking off in the next couple of years as these kinds of technologies start to, enter the broader kind of public for use. And so I'm excited by that as well. Yeah, I don't know if that feels like a satisfying answer to your question, but
It's never satisfying,
Yeah.
Brendan. Well, always want more power to move in between. I'm interested in the failed developmental tasks. Ex-psychotherapists, that's where pathology comes from. People reaching in. What I'm seeing at a collective level is kind of a defensive shield around some of the ideologies that are prophylactic to that upshift. And that's what I'm kind of looking for some edge with, and
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and also, again, for me, the nuancing of all this stuff is always really important because, like, the way that development interfaces with trauma is also a fascinating thing where, like, you'll see someone, hey, wait a second, you're scoring super high in this lectical, assessment in some way. And so complexity levels here, but the faith meaning system that you're using is over here. What's going on with that sort of discrepancy, right? Because it's not, I don't think, as simple as reducing one to the other. And then it's sort of like all these other aspects that need to be considered and how people collectively are engaging with trauma, with uncertainty, with confusion, with all sorts of other kind of psychological stressors. There's a lot of other dynamics that aren't just reducible to complexity and yet interface with complexification. And so, again, I think the more sophisticated we can get with some of these models and the more multidimensional they get, we won't always be trying to, jam a square peg into a round hole. We can actually deal with the underlying issues more effectively, which, again, I think is also ways that this informs our kind of theory of change stuff, right? That sort of thing.
Thanks, Brendan.
Yeah.
Nick, I think we're gonna wrap up here. So I would encourage you to take your last question maybe offline, because we've been at this for 90 minutes now, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Brendan, thank you so much for this conversation, for this presentation, for this work. I love this idea of you being our research and development arm at IAM. I mean, we really do need a good ruler in order to be able to do almost anything that we want to do in a developmental sense. So just want to commend you on your sort of leadership in this work. So thank you very much. And thank you all for hanging with us here. There's a lot of rich information that we can take back and really start to think about how this does apply to our initiatives and our work. And so I want to thank everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I wish, if I had more time, there's a whole number of thanks I'd like to give, but yeah, in the interest of time, I'll leave it off. I'll just say thank you all very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brendan. Fantastic
Thank you.
job.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being there.